am going to be explaining the DCML pathway. The DCML pathway, each of these letters in the acronym do stand for something very important and symbolize a special part of this pathway. DC stands for dorsal column, which I'll get to its significance in a bit. Medial lemniscus also represents something very specific along the pathway that I will also get to. So when trying to memorize information about the DCML or how it works, sometimes it can be useful to think about what each of these correlate to, and that will help you remember pathway. So, DCML pathway, what kind of information does it carry? It carries two kinds of information, proprioception and localizable touch. Proprioception is body awareness. Localizable touch is how we know the difference between someone touching us on the neck versus someone touching us on the toe. I'm going to list those here so we don't forget. Alrighty, so we're going to begin with the first order neuron. The first order neuron is going to be located, its cell body is going to be located here in the dorsal root ganglion. Now, its dendrites are located outside of that in the peripheral nervous system. I'll show you here. Here are its dendrites. Now, these dendrites hold mechanoreceptors, which is going to be receiving that stimuli that we get either by proprioception or localizable touch. So for this case, we are going to say that someone touched us on the face. Now we'll explain what that refers to once we get there. So, as you can see, here's our first order neuron. And I'm going to minimize confusion, I'm going to actually redraw this a little bit, because this represents our dorsal root ganglion. So we have our first order neuron right here. Now, its axon is going to travel to a very specific portion of the spinal cord here. So I'm going to draw two dorsal columns. And look, here we go. DC, dorsal columns. These are very, very important in understanding how this pathway works. All right, here are the dorsal columns. Now, each of these are very important, and they're different from each other when we're talking about whether stimulus is coming in through the upper body or the lower body. So the one that is closest to the outside is going to be the fasciculus cuneatus. That's going to hold all upper body, which someone touched our face. So that's actually the pathway that we're going to be following in this example today. This other one is the fasciculus gracilis. And it correlates to both the so this one correlates to the nucleus gracilis, which I'm going to say is right up here. Fasciculus cuneatus, what do you guess? It's the nucleus cuneatus up here. And that's going to be very important when we talk about synapsing, which the first synapse that we're going to have is going to be in these nuclei, depending on whether it's upper or lower body. And that's going to be in the medulla. So I'm going to write medulla here so we don't get confused. So here we have our first order neuron. Its axon is going to travel through that dorsal root. So here is the dorsal root ganglion. So we're going to go through the dorsal root. And remember, our face was touched here. So we're going to go through the fasciculus gracilis right here. And then we are going to synapse onto a second order neuron. So you see the axon going all the way up to that nucleus cuneatus. It's going to synapse. And the second order neuron I'm going to have labeled here by orange. I'm going to say second order so we don't get confused. And I'll also label for clarity that this was our first order neuron. You can see the axon going up there. All right, here's our second order neuron. So it's going to synapse onto that second order neuron. This is where things can get a little bit tricky. So that second order neuron, its cell body is in the nucleus cuneatus, because we're talking about touch to the face, not in the gracilis. So then it's synapsed here, right, in the medulla. Now, it's going to decusate, which means to cross over. Now, it's not going to cross over just like this. it has to go through the midline. That's an important point to make. So it's going, here's its axon, it's going to go through the midline, and then we are going to start going up, 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 up through, this is called the medial lemniscus. Medial lemniscus, back, it's a tract of unmyelinated axons. That's what we're going to be following here. Medial lemniscus. We're going up, 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 up. There's our axon. Now it doesn't stop here, but I want to point out something first. Where's our end destination? Where are we trying to go here? We're trying to go to the thalamus. And we're not just trying to go to a random part of the thalamus. We're trying to go to a very specific point of that thalamus. And that is going to be the VPLN. So the VPLN, I'm going to mark it here, stands for the ventral posterolateral nucleus. This is a very important part because the synapse is going to be happening here. So already we've seen DC, dorsal column, and ML, medial lemniscus, already represented. So we already see kind of why these things are in the pathway because they're very essential parts of the pathway. So anyway, here we have our second order neurons, axon, going up, 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 all the way until we get to the VPL. Now it's going to synapse onto a third order neuron. Let's see, what color should I use? I'm not going to use black. I'm going to use like a lighter green for this one. And here's its cell body. So the cell body of that third order neuron is in the VPL. Its body is in there, so are the dendrites as well. Now, you may think, all right, we've reached the thalamus, we're in the brain, we're done. Well, we're not. So here we have that third order neuron right here, and its axon is going to extend to a very specific part of the brain. It's going to be the primary sensory strip, but again, it's going to be to a specific part of that strip, the part that we receive the stimulus from. So someone touched us on the face, right? And I drew a little face right here, and I told you that this would be important later. So as you can see, we have this face here. So here's the axon from that third order neuron. Right after that second order neuron came all the way here, decussated, went up, synapsed onto that third order neuron, and it goes straight to that area of the cortex that it's related to. Again, that's this primary sensory strip and the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe, which, as you know, has to do with our localization of touch and our sensation of touch. And so it goes all the way through here. Now, it doesn't just go straight through, it passes some very important areas, one of which is the internal capsule. Another one is the corona radiata. Both of these are made out of white matter. You can kind of think of it kind of like a highway when you look at a picture of these things. They kind of look like fibers kind of springing out from each other. And so then we land here, and now our brain knows that someone has touched us on the face. So we've actually reached the end of this tract, of the DCML tract. Hello, today I'm going to be explaining the spinocerebellar pathway. Spinocerebellar pathway. Now, I'm going to begin with what kind of information is carried along this pathway. So as I spoke of in the previous video, or if you're watching this in reverse, the next video, the DCML, we were talking about localizable touch and conscious proprioception. This is going to be carrying unconscious proprioception, and it makes a lot of sense when we think about where the final synapse happens, which is going to be in the cerebellum. So that information is not going to reach the cortex. It's not even going up to the brain. As you see, I didn't have a picture of the brain or the lobes up at the top represented here because it doesn't go that far because it's unconscious. So this is all unconscious proprioception. And unconscious proprioception is basically the idea that we do things that we're not always aware of with our bodies. When we stand up to take a step, we do not think about every single thing we need to do with our legs and with our arms. We just do it. And so that's kind of the kind of signaling that's being passed through this pathway or this tract. Now, here we have represented, I said this is the cerebellum. here we have the spinal cord, kind of a cross-section look at this. This is going to be the ventral root. This is the dorsal root, which again, this is kind of most of what we've been talking about and focusing on. And I'm going to draw first our dorsal root ganglion. So just like the DCML, the cell body for the first order neuron is going to be in the dorsal root ganglion. So I'm going to have that represented right here. So this is going to be our first order neuron. Now, just like the DCML, the first order neuron is unipolar. So it's going to have a cell body here, and it's going to have its axon one of its axons over here, with dendrites sticking out into the PNS. And attached to these are going to be proprioceptive receptors. And those receptors are going to be what's taking in that kind of unconscious body awareness, unconscious proprioception. From joints, from muscles, from tendons, from limbs, from all of that. So that's going to come through here. So we're going to have that come in through this axon here into our cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. Then we're going to have our axon extend through that dorsal root all the way until we reach the dorsal horn here. Once we are in the dorsal horn, this is where we are going to find our second order neuron. So the second order neuron I'm going to represent in pink, and its cell body is in the dorsal horn. So are its dendrites. So here we have our axon. Now, our axon I'm about to draw. I haven't drawn it yet. But once I draw the axon, I'm going to have a few different colors. I'm going to use 3 different colors because there are actually 3 different ways that this axon can travel up to the cerebellum to give us the signaling about unconscious proprioception. So we have 2 different areas. We have anterior and posterior. Now I'm going to make a quick comment about this to minimize confusion. So for the anterior and posterior portions, we are not talking about a wide difference in anterior and posterior. As we've learned in this class and in anatomy as well, anterior and posterior, all of those anatomical terms are very contextual. So right now we're talking about this area. We're not talking about, anterior way down here, posterior way back here. It's not like that. They're actually both going to be on the lateral side here in this dorsal horn. So we're going to begin with the easy one, which is posterior. And it only has one way to travel. So for posterior, let's use red. So as you can see, first order neuron, going back a little bit, its axon traveling and its synapses onto this second order neuron. So I'm going to take that back. I'm not going to do red for that, I'm going to do pink. So pink because, and then all the different axons for the different ways I'm going to symbolize differently, but we need to know that those different axons still relate to the second order neuron, and these are basically potential ways that second order neuron's axon can go. So this is going to be the posterior option. So I'm going to put it right here. And what's going to happen is it's going to go straight up. It moves ipsilaterally. So it's going to go straight up the cerebellum, and because it's posterior, it's going to go through the inferior peduncle. Then it's going to synapse, and then we're done. That's it. That's it for the posterior. However, important to realize that for all of these that I'm about to go into, even though we have some hint decusation coming, everything synapses and ends on the ipsilateral side that it began on. So contrary to what we saw in the DCML, we have contralateral motion, right? We are decusating, we are going up, and we are ending somewhere on the opposite side that we began. That goes into that whole idea of things that are processed on the right side of your body are, signaled through your left, and all of that kind of, that dichotomy there. That does not apply for this pathway. So there we go. That's the posterior, goes through that inferior peduncle, done. Anterior is where things get a little confusing. So again, I'm still using that pink second order neuron. The axon colors are going to change though. So let's say we're doing anterior. Now anterior, we have 2 options. We can either basically copycat the posterior, do the same thing, just go straight up and synapse. Posterior, is a little weird. So that's where we get some weird decusating. We're actually going to decusate twice, but we're still going to end up ipsilaterally. It's the traveling part that changes, and it's almost kind of like we're taking the scenic route, but our destination is still the same. We're taking the scenic route to get to our destination. And I will say that for that decusating option that this axon can take, there is no reason that it does this. It's been unknown. The research is still out. There's no research on why this happens, and there may not be really a reason at all, and it just could be the way that it wants to travel sometimes. So, for fun, we're going to do the harder one first. The easier one first, where it goes straight up. So we have the anterior, and it's also just going to go straight up, and it's going to synapse. However, it's going to synapse in the superior peduncle. Going through the superior peduncle, and it's going to synapse in the cerebellum. Now, let's do the hard one, which is the anterior decusating option. So here's again our second order neuron, and I'm not going to use that blue because that's going to confuse us. I'm going to use black because it's nice and complicated for no reason. So we're going to take it here. Remember, this is anterior. And we are going to decusate. So right after it synapses, it decusates first. Then it goes up. Then it goes up. Then it decusates again before it reaches the cerebellum. So we haven't reached the cerebellum. We are still going through the spinal cord, not quite there yet. So we are going to decusate over. And then we are going to go up again and synapse in the cerebellum. So that is going to be the endpoint there. So as you can see, we are going here, we are going straight across, you're decusating, we're going up. So you decusate first, up, decusate, and then synapse, go up and synapse. And that is the spinocerebellar pathway.